want to start by asking you, you've been talking about this for a lot longer than a lot of people. What are the characteristics of a bubble that you're seeing in the AI space today?
So the economics make no sense, and the hype around the technical stuff also makes no sense. And those two are coming together. I think for several years, ChatGPT got a free ride. I think that people kept thinking it's going to get better. And I kept saying, no, I've looked at the technical side of this. It'll get a little better, but it's not going to get radically better. So you mentioned I've been working on this for a long time. I wrote a book in 2001 called The Algebraic Mind, which was about neural networks and classical AI and why they might need to be brought together. And I pointed out then that hallucinations would be inevitable in the ancestors to today's systems. So there's been a bunch of problems, reasoning problems and so forth, that have been around for a quarter century. And when ChatGPT came along, most people didn't really know the history, didn't really have the technical side, and they were impressed by how lifelike the system had appeared to be. Those of us who've been around for a while, of course, all remember Eliza in 1966, which pretended to be a human but was really very dumb. And we know that humans can be seduced, and that's what we saw basically is seduction. And a lot of people, I think, believed people like Sam Altman when they said, oh, well, these things called scaling laws, they pretty much guarantee, like they're laws in the universe, that we're going to get to better AI. And then what happened is that a lot of the world believed a lot of his story. He's a consummate salesman, if not, I'm not so hot on him technically, but as a salesman, he's unparalleled. And a lot of people believed him. He had campaigns like, he said AGI is going to be wild after DALL-E 2 came out. He said AGI has been achieved internally as a joke on Reddit and so forth. A lot of people believed it, but when they actually tried it, it didn't work that well. And GPT-4, like everybody tried it. Every CEO on the planet said, or almost every CEO on the planet told their chief information officer or chief technology officer, get this into production. We got to use it. And so everybody did try it. But what they found, by and large, is it didn't work as well as they expected it to be. And then I think the whole world started to change. Certainly my world started to change in August when GPT-5 came out. And I kept saying, it's not going to be magic. It's not going to be artificial general intelligence. I also kept saying it's going to be late. I don't know if anybody remembers the movie Airplane, but the scene at the end, now arriving gate 7, now arriving gate 8, now arriving gate 9 as the plane hurtles across. I actually wrote one of my Substack essays called something like that about GPT-5, and I said it just keeps getting delayed. We don't know when it'll arrive. So when it actually arrived, I think there was a lot of disappointment. It was good, it was better than its predecessor, but it was not magic. And so you had these companies that had tried it out, thought that it was going to be magic, and it wasn't. And I think that that's actually caused a sea change. And when we talk about, will the bubble burst, I think a lot of whether a bubble bursts or not is really psychological. So the economics haven't made sense from the beginning. If you have an AI technology that is not reliable, there's only so many things you can do with it. If you had AI that was really reliable, you could use it for everything.
Yeah, and so let's talk about the economics of it that have been built on top of that, what you see as a shaky foundation there. Anybody who reads the news, and this is, I imagine, a room full of news consumers is reading a lot about data centers and infrastructure and deals and circularity and all these things that, set alarm bells ringing. What is the edifice that's been built on top of this sort of false promise?
Well, so people are investing trillions of dollars. There is an old saying that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Basically, that's been the field of AI for the last few years. They keep doing the experiment. It's really a test of a scientific hypothesis. The scientific hypothesis is you pour more data, you'll eventually get AGI, more chips, bigger computer centers. And the thing is, people keep trying that experiment. It doesn't really work, right? So we had GPT 4.5, was supposed to be called GPT 5, and they didn't call it GPT 5 because it wasn't good enough. We had Llama 4 was disappointing and so forth. The people keep building these big models, and when they don't work, they're like, well, we'll build it even bigger, more, as the kids say nowadays. And so you have two problems here. One is that it's very expensive to train these models. It's very expensive to operate them. And that means you need a really good business model The only one that I can see that might work, and maybe we want to get into this, is surveillance, which I see OpenAI moving into. Porn maybe is we're also seeing OpenAI move into that. But by and large, these companies aren't actually making money. They're losing money. The only company that's making a lot of money is NVIDIA, which is like selling shovels in the gold rush. There may not be any gold in the hills, but the shovels are good, so NVIDIA is cool. And then it turns out there's a music company that's making money. But most of them are not really making money. So that's one of the problems, is it's just enormously expensive, and they keep like playing double or nothing. Now they're playing double or nothing, and we'll probably get into this, with the entire economy, right? So that's one side. And then the other thing is, it's a little crazy what they're doing, because they're not factoring in depreciation. And if there's one thing we know about hardware, they're putting all this money into chips, is that chips don't hold their value very long. So you're going to put $1 trillion into chips that might not be worth very much in 3 years, because there'll be better chips, because there's so much pressure to make better chips. And we're pressuring China to make better chips as well. And so, like, you're losing money, your chips are going to depreciate, the quality that's been promised isn't really there. It doesn't really make sense.
Yeah, I'd like to say that I wore the outfit of the chief shovel maker, Jensen Huang, who's in a leather jacket and jeans, but this is unintentional. He certainly has the money for a lot more leather jackets these days. So I want to talk about that bit you were hitting at the end about sort of betting the economy on this. So there's two parts of it, right? And let's start with the public market. So you've got these valuations that are inflating for public companies and then for private companies. Why does it matter if a bunch of VCs lose a bunch of money on these companies?
If that's all that happens, then we should count ourselves lucky. So I think of us right now as roadrunner at the edge of a cliff. And it's entirely psychological now. We're over the cliff, and it depends when people will notice it for when it will fall. And then the question is, what is the blast radius? So the least damaging is just a bunch of VCs. But we know it's not going to be just that. I mean, if it's just a bunch of VCs, a lot of them have been blowhards for the last few years. Nobody's going to mourn if they get wiped out. Now, some of their money that they're investing, because it's not their own money, is things like the California Pension Fund has a whole, I think maybe close to $1 billion by now in OpenAI. It would be sad for the California Pension Fund if they lose that $1 billion or lose a large fraction of it. So you have the LPs, the limited partners, of which California Pension Fund is one example.
And a lot of Canadian pension funds
and
as well.
Probably the Canadian, I haven't seen the numbers, but I imagine the Canadian Pension Fund, probably everybody's pension fund to some extent. And one version of this is like OpenAI doesn't make a funding round, they're burning money, and eventually they have like a WeWork kind of effect where they don't necessarily go out of business, but their valuation goes way down. Then everybody that is in OpenAI has problems. The next level is, what if everybody who's in NVIDIA has takes a hit? Because NVIDIA is premised on selling a massive number of chips. And if people realize that their customers aren't going to be able to buy all those chips, then NVIDIA goes down. It's not a slight on NVIDIA. I think it's a genuinely good product with a good ecosystem around it and so forth. But the value right now is based on basically the idea they can sell almost infinite numbers of chips. And that could change, right? Let's say that OpenAI has a WeWork moment and collapses. What do you think that's going to do to NVIDIA stock? And everybody who has a pension at this point, not quite literally, but a huge number of people have some NVIDIA because it's in the indexes that people are tied to and so forth. So then that starts to affect everybody's pension fund. And then it could get even worse. And there's lots of numbers that we don't know publicly. But you could start to think, well, what if the banks are screwed? Like, where is all this investment money coming from? How leveraged is it? Might be mighty leveraged. So, the worst case scenario is like the banks take a hit too, and then, we've seen that movie before. I'm pretty confident, not certain, that we are eventually going to hear the phrase too big to fail in reference to this. And then the next level is, what if Donald Trump says, oh my God, we have to beat China. These guys are going out of business. We can't have that. Let's just spend all of your tax money. $230 million for me and $230 billion for them, and everybody is happy. Except we won't all be happy, obviously.
Yeah, and I do want to jump in a second to the consequences of this sort of race or FOMO framing that we've had on these kinds of policy questions. But I want to ask about the impact of a bubble on things like the labor force and the sort of ground level. Because to your point, if every CEO has been going in and telling their operations and CIOs like, let's see what this tech can do for us, we are seeing already, not in gigantic numbers, but some layoffs from this, premised on the idea that this technology will fill those roles. And those people have already been placed.
Interrupt there for a second? It's not clear how much of the layoffs have actually been driven by AI doing people's jobs as opposed to AI giving cover to take away people's jobs. We really don't have clarity about that. And I keep thinking of what I called the Klarna effect, where Klarna said, we're going to replace everybody with AI. And then it didn't really work. And then 18 months back, they were like, we're the people company. And they started rehiring people. So everybody should make fun of Klarna and remember the Klarna effect. So like the number of jobs actually being replaced by AI, I think is relatively modest so far. The number of people fired under the cover of AI is definitely higher. And we don't know the sort of medium-term effects on that. The very long-term effects are, for sure, AI, maybe not generative AI, which I've argued is technically inadequate, but some form of AI someday certainly will take a lot of employment. But another barrier is physical robots. Like Elon can tell us how many robots he thinks is going to happen next year or whatever. I keep offering him bets that he never takes. We're not going to see really skilled physical robots, kind of general purpose in the home and so forth anytime soon. Yeah. And jobs like plumber, there's like no way that we're going to have a robot this decade that can do a job like that.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's an interesting question about the displacement that happens if you have that sort of preemptive or under the cover of AI job displacement, and then the bubble bursts and the whole economy's in the tank, and now those people are even worse off.
Yeah, I mean, that's an entirely possible scenario. And again, it gets to the blast radius. Who is affected? How into this are they? Like nobody really knows how far the ramifications are. The happiest scenario, again, is it's just a few VCs, and we won't name names, but there are other scenarios that are pretty dark for a lot of us.
So let's do that promised regulatory bit. We've heard a lot from this stage over the last 2 days about the compromises, or to take the other side, the bets that companies and governments and societies are making for AI. So,
yeah.
On the one hand, you have the Trump administration basically saying both domestically and globally, regulation stifles innovation and don't you dare touch our big tech companies. We had the AI minister on this stage yesterday basically talking about the fact that the US and China believe that regulation stifles innovation and Canada needs to make its choices accordingly.
I'll let you finish the question, but I just want to flag, that's an assertion. I think you're very clear on that by the way you're asking. It's an assertion that regulation stifles innovation. It's not an assertion with a whole lot of evidence.
Right, yeah, and I think that's really what I'm getting at is, if you're right about the bubble, have we basically reoriented all of our policy, our social policy, our economic policy, our safety policy on the internet for this thing, and then what happens if it doesn't come to pass?
That's exactly what I argued 2 weeks ago at the Royal Society in London, is we've structured our entire society around a bet about one particular technology. And anyone who's an actual scientist can look at it and say, well, it's a hypothesis. The hypothesis is these scaling laws, that you will draw these curves and that they will keep going, you'll add enough data and you will get to AGI. We now have a lot of evidence against that hypothesis, but you're exactly right. We've organized our entire society around it. Like, it's a little mind-boggling to me because I've been thinking about, like, what is thinking, can machines think, since I was 10 or, depending on how you count it, 13 years old. And these were always academic questions. Like, I studied, my first class in college was metaphysics, and I wrote an essay about whether machines could think. Like, these were just really abstract questions. They were fun to think about, but now we are literally structuring our society around the assumption that chatbots can think, that we're someday going to be able to rely on them, et cetera. And then there's this whole, I think you wanted to get at it too, this whole assumption that we should do our geopolitical policy around this. My joke before GPT-5 came out, well, let me rewind one sentence. Before GPT-5 came out, a bunch of people signed a letter, including me, though I signed it for very different reasons than they did. People were genuinely worried that GPT-5 was going to kill us all. Like, there were some people who really thought that. Right. And then there was a whole argument that, like, we couldn't let China get GPT-5 first. And my thought was like, why? The problem with these systems is they're very bad when there's incomplete information, unusual situations. So I imagine China plotting the invasion of Taiwan with GPT-5, and I'm like, have at it. Let them do it. Let it hallucinate. That'll make our job easier.
Yeah.
So, and then my other joke about it was, well, so what are they going to do if they have GPT-5 first? They're going to write more boilerplate text than we do? Like, and then the reality is GPT-5 came first, and it didn't really matter.
Yeah.
So we like, I mean, is there anything like we've got some superiority over China now that we have GPT-5 and they don't, they'll have it in 4 weeks? Like, it's just relevant. But yet we're saying like no regulation because we don't want to slow things down. So let's come back to that part of it, which is like if you look at the history, and I don't know all of the history, but if you look at the history of regulation technology, sometimes regulation actually spurs technology. Like you get safer cars. Or back in the day, trains had sparks. This is where the term guardrail, I think, comes from. It had sparks that would, burn down the houses that were near the train line. So we put up guardrail. And people didn't trust the trains. And so we put regulations so that they would trust the train. Or think about commercial airlines. I've taken 7 in the last 10 days or something like that. I don't really feel worried when I take commercial airlines. Well, why not? It's because there's 3 layers of, or more than 3 layers, depending on the count of regulation, on how the things are built, how they're designed, how they're maintained, how they're investigated if there's an accident. Like, if you took away regulation, I would not get on a commercial airline. Or if you told me this country, I mean, all countries participate, but if you told me this country is voluntarily not participating because they want to spur innovation in the airline industry, I'd be like, no, thank you.
Yeah, and it turns out actually we have although if you've been stranded in an airport, you won't feel this, we have a much better airline safety organization here than in a lot of places, it turns out, for weird historical reasons.
But that's a place actually where we do have international collaboration too. It works really well. It's not perfect, but it works really, really well.
Going back to the idea of assertions, so there's a question mark on the end of the title of this conversation, will the AI bubble burst? So I would like, just, for the sake of argument, what would prevent the AI bubble from bursting?
Subsidies, I guess. I mean, I think if the federal government wanted to spend enough taxpayer dollars, they could keep it going. And in some sense, they're already doing that in various kinds of covert ways, or not even that covert. I mean, the US government just bought 10% of Intel, I believe. And so, there are ways in which you can keep it going. Then, of course, we have the new circular economics, where OpenAI takes money from Oracle that gives money back to OpenAI, and so there's a lot of little games like that. My sense is that investors are starting to worry about that a bit, and that it won't last indefinitely. But it is about psychology. I keep thinking about the tulips. I think it was 1634 in Holland, right? And they kept going up and up and up, and it was obvious, I think, to a lot of bystanders that this was crazy. And the bystanders maybe split into 2 camps, like, this is crazy, I won't touch this, and this is crazy, everybody else is crazy, I'll make a little money off of it while it lasts. And, some of those people made money and some of them didn't. But, you can reach a point where you say this is absurd, but you don't know when the psychology is going to break. I see a lot of signs now that it is starting to break, but I can't say for sure. I mean, I think Tesla has been overvalued radically since, I guess, 2021 or something like that. Like, its valuation also makes no sense to me. Tesla makes, electric cars, and BYD now makes them better and cheaper, I guess, or at least cheaper, and reasonably good. And then the rest of Tesla is built on a fantasy about driverless cars, but they're not all that good at making them yet. And robots, which is even a sillier discussion we could have. But it's sustained for a long time, partly because of whatever influence he has over his followers. And so the psychology part is hard to entirely predict. So the psychology, if there's enough propaganda, I mean, we've heard a lot about propaganda today. That goes on in the business world too, not just in the political world. So, it's possible that propaganda could sustain it. It's possible that government subsidies could sustain it. But the big problem is, these guys keep talking about exponentials. Their investments are going up exponentially. And so what you have is a company like OpenAI, where they have to make these huge funding rounds. They have to keep making the valuations higher. And at some point, they're going to say, well, we need another, billion, or another $100 billion for the next period. And somebody's going to say, well, I can't write you that check. And at that point, I think that's when it starts to fall.
Yeah, and certainly, the biggest funding rounds now have so many players involved in them.
So many players and so much interdependence. So also, if one company that's prominent, like OpenAI, falters, they don't even have to fail, but there's this falter, then it's going to spread like wildfire.
So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about the alternative here.
The technical alternative.
The technical alternative, and then the consequences of the technical alternative, because I think those are worth thinking through as well. So, as you say, more and more people are coming around. Richard Sutton, who's a prof in Alberta, who's many of you will have heard of. He's the third sort of seat on the Benchio Hinton Sutton sort of table as far as Canada is concerned. Basically tweeted that you were right a little while ago.
Yeah, that was phenomenal. Just a few weeks ago, Richard Sutton, who's famous for this thing, The Bitter Lesson, which is basically an argument that the only thing that's ever worked is more data, came out against LLMs, and we had a little chat about it on Twitter, and he complimented me and said, you were right all along, and we really appreciate it. It was phenomenal to hear that from someone in the sort of AI mainstream acknowledge that things have changed and we might need an alternative.
So your alternative is something called neurosymbolic AI. So at a second grade reading level, what is that?
I can't do second, but maybe I can do ninth grade or something like that.
Okay, fair enough.
So most people in the room probably know Daniel Kahneman's System 1 and System 2 distinction. So Kahneman talked about the human mind, but I think there's a parallel in AI. So in Kahneman's distinction, we have part of cognition is fast, automatic, reflexive, kind of statistically driven. And then part of it is more deliberative, more abstract, and more reasoned. If you think about the history of AI, basically those two have been pursued in different schools of thought. So neural networks that are popular now are basically like System 1, and classical AI is basically like System 2. And for various political and sociological reasons, mostly having to do with money and graduate students, prestige and stuff like that, the people in these two schools have hated each other and been extremely non-cooperative. And I think part of what we need to do to have a better technical approach is to actually bring those two traditions together. There are other things we need to bring together too, like probabilistic logic and probabilistic programming. And so we need to have a more integrated field and less of this, me. Like the field of AI has very much been dominated by egomaniacs, let's say. And it's time to have some integration of these different approaches. That by itself is not necessary. Is necessary but not sufficient.
Right.
So, I've been arguing for that going back to my book, The Algebraic Mind, which was really my first long-form argument for that. It's not enough. The other thing that we really need, and a lot of people have started to recognize this in the last several months, but I've been pushing it for a long time, is what I would call world models. So a world model is, for a human, it's representation in your brain of an external world. Might be a physical world, like we can represent that we're in this auditorium. Now that I'm sitting up here, I can kind of look up there and add some things to it. We represent the people that we're talking to, so I see you nodding your head. I know I'm not going on too long, or you laugh, and I know my joke's landed or not.
Yeah.
Because there's so much light here, I don't really see too much of the audience, so I have an incomplete representation of the audience.
Yeah.
But we're building these models. We also build these models of fictional domains. So my kids just read all of the Harry Potter books and watched all of the movies, so they have represent a different world for the the Hogwarts arena, or whatever you want to call it, where people fly on broomsticks and cast spells. And they're, my kids are young, but they're perfectly able to discriminate between these two worlds and to reason about the laws of this world as opposed to that world. So we have these internal things. A chessboard would be another. We know where the pieces are. LLMs don't do that very well. I could go into why, but they don't. What we need is a way of learning those world models from data. We know how to program them in advance. Some of the best AI is not chatbots, but systems that actually have world models programmed in advance. So GPS navigation systems build any world model, pretty much literally, and are pretty flawless at what they do. AlphaFold is one of my favorite pieces of AI. It has a model built in of nucleotides and the three-dimensional structure of proteins, and it works within that domain. But how do you have a system from data, whatever data that might be, build a world model? I think neurosymbolic AI that I've long favored is a prerequisite to that, but it's not enough to do that. There's still some really hard problems there that we haven't confronted. When people say AGI in 2 years, I'm like, you've got to be kidding me. We don't even have a beginning of an answer to that problem.
Yeah, and so you've explained how the technical foundations of them are different and how it gets further than sort of the barrier that you imagine we'll get to, or we have already gotten to with LLMs. But so there are the technical problems with generative AI as they exist now. So things like hallucinations or their lack of capability in certain domains. But there are also the consequences of when they are used in the real world. So that you get things like Professor Mangio on stage yesterday was talking about disinformation or sort of more compelling propaganda. There's the resource use, all of these things. Are those problems inherent to any form of AI, or are they specific to the type we're pursuing right now?
It's a really, really good question. So I wish more people would ask me that question. So LLMs, I like to say, are morally and technically inadequate. And some of the moral inadequacy comes from the technical inadequacy, and some of it comes from the power and capitalism and so forth, and how they're getting developed in the real world. On the technical side, the key flaw that leads to some of the moral flaws is these systems are not based in fact and they're unreliable. And so that means that they can be exploited in different ways. So, for example, you can use them to generate misinformation and they don't know any better, right? That you can't program ethical principles into them either. I don't think this is a logical requirement of AI. I can imagine an AI and may start to work on an AI that would be grounded in facts, that would hopefully be more reliable, that might be grounded in ethical principles. You can certainly imagine such things. The current systems are terrible at that, and that makes them very easy to exploit, to say, go make up videos about these things that haven't happened. You could imagine an AI that would say, no, I'm not going to do that. And we have guardrails in these systems that try to do that a little bit, but because we don't have a very deep AI, it's all very superficial, these guardrails don't work. Like you program into the so-called system prompt into these systems, don't hallucinate or don't tell people how to make biological weapons, but they hallucinate anyway, and it's actually pretty easy to trick them into making or telling you how to make biological weapons. So I think that the better forms of AI can certainly be conceived of. I see some of the avenues to get there. I think it's really hard problems. I don't think it's close at hand. I like to think of a cognitive psychologist, evolutionary psychologist, Jeffrey Miller, posted something on Twitter that I really loved. It sounds kind of arch or ironic, but it should be taken seriously. He said, no problem building AGI, but let's just wait until we understand the so-called alignment problem of how to make it safe. And then he continues, even if that takes 250 years. Like nobody has the stomach to wait, 250 days, let alone 250 years. But he's right. Like we should not be building systems that are potentially this dangerous if we don't have clear answers to like, how do you make this safe? I think we might be able to do that in other architectures. I think there's no way we can do it with LLMs, and yet here we are rushing forward.
Yeah, and actually that brings me to a nice thing for a nice second last question as I eye that clock on the AGI question. So you were saying earlier that. About this sort of job loss idea that in the long term there may in fact be job replacement, even if it's a cover right now. And there will be societal impacts to AGI, whether it's the better form that you favor or the form that we're headed towards now. Do societies and people get a choice on this? Or is AGI a commercial and scientific inevitability?
We do get a choice. We're not doing a good job taking that choice. I mean, I loved Maria's talk earlier this morning, and the main reason, well, there are many reasons I love Maria's talk, actually, but one of them was so much emphasis on empowerment, right? We do still have power in this situation. I mean, if everybody in the globe said, I'm not going to use ChatGPT until they fix this, OpenAI would be responsive to their customers. They need their customers to make their arguments about getting more funding. Right now we don't have a lot of will, and we've seen lack of willpower before. Facebook eroded privacy, and nobody, or hardly anybody, stood up. We do still have power as citizens, and I mean, we saw interesting poll data from Ipsos today. A lot of people are unhappy with what's going on. Not enough people are actually protesting what's going on in the AI set of issues. I was glad to see how many people came out for the No Kings. If more people protested, we might be able to do something. However, the default is not good, right? If people don't stand up loudly, all the power, as this conference has very much emphasized, is going to the tech companies. Governments are not doing much about it, and they won't unless we stand up and fight.
Okay, so you've proven over the course of this conversation that you're not in it for the easy answers, but I will ask you the question of our title. Will the AI bubble burst?
I think it will. I don't really want to guess a day. There's an old saying in business, the market can remain irrational longer than you can remain solvent. which is why individual investors shouldn't short things. And so I don't know when, but there's a lot of times in science, certainly historically, where science had wrong ideas, pursued them for a long time, and eventually sorted it out. And so like thinking that genes were made up of proteins was just wrong. We wasted 20 years thinking that, and then we got it right. I think we've wasted, 10 years on neural networks, which turn out to be part of the answer, but not the whole answer. And that's actually dawning on people. When it really dawns on enough people, they'll realize that these trillion-dollar investments are premature, don't make sense. We should be spending them on intellectual diversification instead of going all in on this idea that doesn't work. Also, investors will be like, where are the profits? They're starting to do some of that. So I think sometime, relatively soonish, but I don't know how soon, that it will in fact burst.
Well, Taylor, we'll have to have you back to talk about it when it does. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much.